What's up, guys? Josh with Goals Finishing. Today we're going to be working on this desk. Something cool about this desk, I picked it up for 40 bucks, planning on refinishing it, and then I was starting to watch YouTube and watching some other guys do some of their work, and John Bear Woodworks, you have to check him out, he does awesome work. I ran into one of his videos where he's doing this exact same desk, and he does an excellent job on it. So I'm going to see if I can do something with it, and yeah, we'll go from there. So let's get into it. Don't forget to hit subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comments box. Let's get into it. Alright, so I'm starting by taking off the legs. It's simply screwed on, just twisting those off. So they had these pins in the top there, that as you can see, and those were little padded buttons to protect when it opened. The piece laid on top of that, and they just looked really ugly. I don't think anyone's going to be slamming that thing open. If they do, that's their fault, but I took those off because they were super ugly. So we're just going to fill those up with some epoxy putty and leave it. Notice some heavy scratching in the top, so I decided to go in with my 120 grit orbital and sand off the top and kind of bring out some of those scratches. So I'm doing a lot of hand sanding on this piece. There was a lot of special details on it that really needed attention, so I didn't want to ruin that by putting an orbital on it. So I went through and hand sanded almost the entire thing besides the top. As you can see here, I am using a sanding block to hit those edges. The reason I use a sanding block instead of hand sanding, and you can use a hand sander, it's kind of your preference, but I use a sanding block because it kind of rounds over those edges and kind of forms to it and sands it evenly, so I like to use a sanding block for that. I'm also using a sanding block for the legs because, you know, they're obviously rounded, so it'll help contour that really well. Now I'm going through and making sure I clean everything off with mineral spirits. And since I am going to do an oil on this one, I'm going to go ahead and go through that twice. And I only showed you the one time, but I cleaned everything off twice, just to make sure that I got all the dust out and made sure all the, you know, tight corners and everything were cleaned out so I could apply the oil really well. The epoxy putty has a white gray tint to it, and so it will show up white gray on the piece, but something to consider is you guys can take a wood stain and kind of darken it up a little bit. I found out that oil doesn't really impact the color of it, but it ended up covering it up just enough to where it's very invisible, and the holes are so small to begin with, it's not very noticeable. Now I'm going through with my black walnut Danish oil. So I'm making sure to run my rag in the direction of the grain, as you can see. This, when you sand, you always sand in the direction of the grain, right? So the same goes for the scratches that you put in it, and the same goes for the chemicals that you put into it. So when you scratch your product in a vertical direction with the grain or parallel with it, you need to put your chemical on the same way. So as you can see, I'm going in one smooth motion with the grain. That way it pushes that material down in there. If you go cross grain, sometimes that won't adhere very well or sink into the pores very well. So make sure you wipe on with the grain. Now I'm taking my rag and making sure after about 15 minutes to wipe it back down. You need to do this on your Danish oils because it helps take off the leftovers. Sometimes the pores only accept so much, and so it leaves residue. And so you need to go back over with a rag. You don't have to put anything on it, but just with a dry white rag or a tack cloth or something, and pick up all that leftover residue of that oil. So you get a non-sticky finish at the end. Now I'm going through and doing the legs. I started with a rag and it did good on all the surface parts of it, but those tight crevices that were turned, on the lathe real tightly, those need to be brushed with either a brush, or I used a sponge pad or a sponge brush to kind of force that oil into those spots that are real tight to get. And then I went over with my rag later and cleared all that out. I'm also doing the same thing for the raised panel, making sure those crevices are filled up with oil correctly and then wiped down at the end. The drawer bottom was actually the roughest part of the piece. The entire piece was in really good shape. Even the drawer bottom was in good shape. It was just unattended. A lot of those old manufacturers and new today don't pay attention to unseen things. Um, so, like this old piece had, obviously the drawer bottom was not stained properly or oiled properly, whatever you call it, and so it just looked kind of ugly. So I went through and put an oil down there after sanding, and it turned out really nice. Now I'm putting everything back together, putting those hinges on to put that panel back on. Now I'm putting the desktop back on along with the drawer. Alright guys, so that about wraps it up. Put some nice Danish oil on there, turned out real smooth. If you guys liked the video, don't forget to hit subscribe. Check out some of my other videos on some furniture that I did. Coming out with more all the time, so make sure to stay tuned. Drop a comment in the comments box if you guys have any questions, and I'll try and answer them as best as possible. So we'll see you guys later. Thanks.